I think some of our classes are just getting out a little early. Some of them go until noon, and they're gradually coming from one class to the main event here. Well, this is our annual Charles and Rosemary Licata lecture series, and some of you will have been here through the years, as every year we have had some outstanding speakers. And I hope that all of you picked up a program when you came in, because the program lists a number of all of the former speakers of the lecture series. The very first one we had, I believe, was Steve Forbes, and we staged that lecture downtown at the Biltmore Hotel. Most of them we've had here on campus, a couple of them we've had elsewhere. Among the Charles and Rosemary Licata lectures have been not only Steve Forbes, but Bill Martin, a friend of mine from Rice University, Michael Novak. Many of you will know his work, his best known work on capitalism, democratic capitalism. James Pearson, who for many years was president of the Olin Foundation and now the William Simon Foundation. Pierre Prosper, who also is a graduate of the law school and was U.S. Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues. David Davenport, a former president of Pepperdine. Shelby Steele, Hoover Fellow, Senior Fellow at Hoover at Stanford. James Q. Wilson, one of our founding fathers here, who needs no introduction. Bob Woodson, African-American activist in the neighborhood movement in Washington, D.C. So there is as you can see, Ed, you follow a group of very impressive people. In addition to that, we have two of the former Licata lecturers here with us today. Last year, our Licata lecturer was our own Gordon Lloyd. Gordon, glad to have you here with us today. And then the year before Gordon was Karen Elliott House, and Karen is here today. She is a visiting William E. Simon visiting professor, teaching a class on Islam and the Middle East with our students here this semester. And I see Peter has joined us, Peter Kahn, her husband as well. Peter, delighted to have you. So this is a lecture series that honors Charles and Rosemary Licata, who are here on the front, Rosemary and her wife Beatrice. Beatrice is a close friend of ours, as well as of the law school. And we deeply, Dean Taha, they have your name right down between Rosemary and Beatrice, to make sure you behave.
Don't you look beautiful?
So I should introduce Dean Danelle Taha, who is our Dean of the Law School. Now, I kept track of her for the last hour and made sure she behaved there. Rosemary and Beatrice, it's your job now.
Good luck with that.
We're delighted today to welcome this year's Licata lecturer, Professor Edward J. Larson. You have an extensive, not an extensive, but an interesting bio of him in your program, and I'll not read that. But I will add that he is a university professor of history and the Darling Chair in Law at Pepperdine. Now, there aren't but a couple of people at Pepperdine who have the title university president, because he has assignments in more than one school. So if Dean Taha gets tired of him, he's always got another place to go. So Professor Larson not only is an outstanding professor, but he is, as you will notice, a noted author. He has a Pulitzer Prize in history for one of his books on the Scopes trial. His latest book is the center of his comments for us today, entitled "The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1789." He was a fellow at the Fred W. Smith Library for the study of George Washington in Mount Vernon, and has spent a great deal of time there in the process of reviewing and studying and researching for this book. And I must say that the story just of that center is an outstanding story, and I think demonstrates something that's unique about, I'm tempted to say extraordinary and exceptional, about the United States. And that is the very robust private sector that preserves places like Mount Vernon. The government doesn't own it, doesn't run it. It's a group of citizens who felt like it was important to our history, and they formed an organization and taken care of it, and it's blossoming under their leadership. And the very first person to hold the position as a fellow there in this new structure was Ed Larson. We're delighted to have him here today. He's a graduate of Williams College. He has a JD degree from Harvard and a PhD in History of Science from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I know Ed because we together were in the search committee that found and recruited and twisted the arm of Dean Taha to be the dean of the School of Law. And I got acquainted with him there, and then since then, we meet each other periodically on a trail up in the Santa Monica Mountains above us here, a trail that both of us like a lot, and we stop and solve the problems of the world in our minds. And we're delighted to have you.
Thank you much. Thank you so much. Well, it's an honor and a delight to be here. Thank you so much for endowing this series and for being a supporter of the Public Policy School, and thank you to your sister for your support of the law school. We need your support. We try to use the money well. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for that kind invitation, Jim. I was up hiking in those hills, that very trail today, and looking for you, but you had other things to do, apparently. Popular revolutions take many forms, some violent, others peaceful. They are marked by a fundamental transfer of governing authority, typically from below. It is conventional to categorize the American Revolution of 1776 to 83 as the first modern popular revolution, and France's starting in 1789 is the second. Russia began a particularly cataclysmic revolt in 1917, and China finished one in 1949. In recent years, we see revolutions going on continuously, from those in Eastern Europe during the late 1980s to the Arab Spring of the early 2010s, with its still unfinished upheavals in Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. We are reminded by results in Russia, Libya, and elsewhere that popular revolutions do not always end well. Some, as in Russia, lead to tyrannies worse than those that preceded them, and others descend into prolonged domestic chaos, as happened in France and now appears likely in Libya. My point today, with the topic taking the title, Washington's Second Revolution, my point today is without George Washington, either of those results might have happened here. The former, if Washington had not retired following our violent first revolution, and the latter, if he had not reemerged in 1787 for what some historians depict as our peaceful second revolution. Let me explain. Now, Washington stepped down after the American Revolution and left the country's political future to others. Extolled by later historians as the signal event that set the country's political course, this act was similarly praised at the time. Citing examples from Julius Caesar to Oliver Cromwell, and in a few years, of course, they could have added Napoleon, British propagandists during the American Revolution had scoffed at Americans for rebelling against one King George, only to gain another in George Washington. Successful rebel leaders always become tyrants, they charged. Indeed, when expatriate American painter Benjamin West, then living in England, predicted that Washington would retire upon the cessation of hostilities, a skeptical King George III reportedly replied, "Well, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." And when he did so, American ambassador in Paris Thomas Jefferson commented, quote, "The moderation and virtue of a single character probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish." Now, this story, Washington's retirement is known well. So let me focus on the other half of this balancing act, which is less well known. Washington's role in forming a more perfect union through a second revolutionary intervention. Now, when he retired after the war, Washington hoped for an energetic republic to unite the coastal colonies, states by then, and the vast western territories all the way to the Mississippi River, ceded by Britain under the treaty recognizing American independence. He said as much in his pre-retirement circular letter to the states, which he issued shortly before stepping down as general in response to the Confederation's inability to pay its troops and its creditors in 1783. A post-retirement trip to inspect his frontier properties in the Ohio Valley in 1784, which showed him the tenuous nature of Americans' hold on the West, reinforced his conviction that the Articles of Confederation, then looping the 13 sovereign states into a loose alliance called a Confederation of Friendship, that lacked the power to tax or command individuals, must be revised to give the central government direct control over, and this is what he cared about, interstate commerce, foreign affairs, national defense, and taxing and spending for the general welfare. To him, these were essential to promote individual liberty, to protect private property, and preserve independence. The subsequent breakdown of public order in some states, reckless emission of paper money by others, and a worsening of economic conditions everywhere deepened his fears and those of many like-minded Americans. The country was drifting toward the chaos characteristic of popular revolutions where effective new regimes failed to emerge after the fall of repressive old ones. To illustrate this, and to illustrate his feelings and his sentiments on this, I could draw on Washington's letters with any number of people. That was the great blessing of being at Mount Vernon and studying at the library. I was able to have access to all of its papers. And a letter received from George Washington back then would always be saved, so we have an enormous amount of his correspondence. And there are literally hundreds of such letters, dozens of such correspondences, over 25 with different individuals, regular correspondences with people like Henry Knox and John Jay and others, Alexander Hamilton. But let me pick the ones with John Jay, just as an example. He was, of course, at the time, America's brilliant but beleaguered foreign secretary. Early in 1786, Jay urged Washington to emerge from retirement long enough to lead an effort for constitutional reform. Jay wrote to Washington, "Experience has pointed out errors in our national government, which threaten to blast the fruit we expected from our troops." Now, Washington wrote, "I coincide perfectly with your sentiments, but my fear is that the people are not yet sufficiently misled to retract from error." Washington blamed the situation on ignorance among the people regarding the danger to individual freedom and private property from the excesses of democracy in various states, and the wickedness of some state leaders who sought to take advantage of those excesses. Washington wrote to Jay, "Ignorance and design are difficult to combat. It is necessary to revise and amend the Articles of Confederation, I entertain no doubt. But what may be the consequence of that attempt is doubtful. Virtue, I fear, has to a great degree taken its departure from our land." Now, the anxiety reflected in this and the other letters for constitutional reform betray far more fundamental concerns than mere fears of losing the West, simple hopes for a national market economy, and plain desire to repay government creditors, though each of those three issues certainly weighed heavily on both men. Their letters spoke in terms of calamity and commotion, loss of public virtue, and a breakdown of the social fabric under the excesses of majority factions, which were taking away the rights and property of the minority. These are much like the problems we see when popular revolutions fail to spawn balanced representative governments. We're seeing in so many places today. Liberty itself was at risk, Washington wrote, much as it had been in 1776, but this time the threat came from within. Nothing short of a revolution in government was needed to save the United States. What probably bothered him as much as anything is he was so proud of his country. And he said, nothing but a Brit, no one but a Tory could have predicted what was happening to us now. They all said this radical experience in a government of the people, that was the phrase Washington always used, that it would fail. Because everywhere else in the world there were monarchies and some sort of military dictatorships, some sort of government like that. And they said it would never work. And now we have, and this is a phrase he used in several letters, we are becoming a laughingstock of Europe because everything they predicted was coming true. Well, by the end of 1786, with a debtors' insurrection in Massachusetts, wholesale printing of worthless paper money by Rhode Island, an open rebellion in Vermont, Washington began to doubt if America was capable of self-government. He wrote to Bostonian Henry Knox, the Confederation's Secretary of War, notwithstanding the boasted virtue of America, we are far gone in everything bad and ignoble. And so to fellow Virginian James Madison, Washington wrote in November, 13 sovereignties pulling against each other and all tugging at the federal head will soon bring ruin to the whole. Whereas a liberal and energetic constitution, well guarded and closely watched to prevent encroachments, might restore us to that degree of respectability and consequence to which we once had a fair claim. In short, a second revolution, he believed, was needed to complete the first. Well, in March of 1787, 3 months after the disturbances in Massachusetts died down, Washington wrote to Lafayette, perhaps the closest of his aides during the war, about the ongoing impact of Shays' rebellion on the campaign for constitutional reform. He wrote, "These disorders are evident marks of defective government. Indeed, the thinking part of this country are now so satisfied of this fact that most state legislatures have appointed delegates to meet in Philadelphia in General Convention to revise and correct the defects of the federal system." By this point, Virginia had picked Washington to lead its delegation, and he was debating whether he would go. His main worries were that the convention had been called merely to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation, amendments that would require all 13 states to ratify, and everyone knew Rhode Island and New York wouldn't do it, not to frame a fundamentally new government. And the people might not be ready to accept such a revolutionary overhaul. Washington now wrote, "A thorough reform of the present system is indispensable. And with hand and heart, I hope the business will be essayed in the full convention." Fearing that some states might limit their delegates, Washington reiterated this hope that the convention, and I'm quoting here, would probe the defects of the Constitution to the bottom and provide radical cures. Only on these terms would he attend. By this point, Washington had written to Jay, Knox, and Madison requesting their advice on the restructured government. What could we put? How should it be worked? He wrote to all three of those men. They all sent replies to him, and struck by the similarities of their responses, Washington, in his own hand, prepared an abstract of those. An abstract that looks quite a bit like the Constitution we ended up getting. All three men envisioned a national government, that was the phrase they used, with separate legislative, judicial, and executive branches. The Articles of Confederation had a single House legislature, much like the UN General Assembly, with each state having one vote, and no judicial or executive branches. All three would divide Congress into an elite upper house and a lower popular house. And all three were obsessed with reigning in the states. As Madison wrote, but he was typical of all three, the national government should be armed with positive and complete authority in all cases which require uniformity. Very carefully chosen words. This became the key feature of America's second revolution. One nation out of many states. E pluribus unum. In his responses to Knox, Jay, and Madison, Washington embraced their proposals and made them his own. He wrote to Jay, "Those enumerated in your letter are so obvious and sensibly felt that no logic can controvert. But is the public mind matured for such an important change? Expressing similar sentiments to Knox, Washington stated his fears that, quote, the political machine might yet be much tumbled and tossed and possibly wrecked altogether before such a system as you have defined will be adopted. Jealous of power, state officials, and again I'm quoting, would give their weight of opposition to such a revolution. Yes, he used that word, revolution, Washington predicted. Nevertheless, he wrote to Jay that he wished to try the convention route and find out what could be effected. He wrote, it might represent the last peaceable mode of saving the Union. And should it devise a new constitution under his leadership, Knox then wrote back to Washington that you, Washington, would have doubly earned the glorious Republican epithet, the father of your country. Now, make no mistake about it, Washington did not want to go, but he now saw it as his civic duty, and he believed in civic duty. So he went. Americans everywhere understood this and discussed its significance. The Connecticut Journal, for example, reported when word leaked out that Washington had agreed to go, it wrote, and I could pick dozens of other articles that read much the same way. It is with particular satisfaction that we inform the public that our illustrious fellow citizen, George Washington, in all capital letters, has consented to serve in the ensuing federal convention. What happy consequences may not all true friends of federal government promise themselves? This and other popular accounts show that even before it began, Americans expected revolutionary change from the convention. Reflecting on his commitment to serve, Washington was one of the few delegates to actually arrive in Philadelphia on time. He duly went to the State House at the appointed hour, noon on May 14th, to find only James Madison and the local Pennsylvania delegates present. That was it. They returned daily, day after day at noon, as other delegates trickled in. But it took 10 days to obtain a quorum. In the meantime, and this was very important, meeting privately, the Virginians present, and apparently the Pennsylvanians, cobbled together the outline for a new plan of government. It became known as the Virginia Plan because Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph offered it at the convention. Little is known about those meetings, but letters from those present suggested that Washington attended each one and clearly supported the outcome. As one Virginian depicted the still-forming plan, nothing less than a revolution in government was brewing. He wrote, the most prevalent idea seems to be a total alternation of the present federal system in substituting one great national council with full legislative powers over all the objects of union. This sentence effectively summarizes the Virginia Plan. People would replace states as the building block of the national republic. On matters of national interest, Congress would either dictate to the states or deal directly with the people. When the convention did obtain a quorum, it promptly chose George Washington as its president and turned to other matters of rules. Those rules provided so long as it was represented, each state would have one vote. The majority of states present could carry a vote, and secrecy would obtain throughout. With windows shuttered and doors closed, the members met day after day, 6 days a week, for over 3 months during that long, hot Philadelphia summer. Delegates came and went. They didn't all stay for the whole time. States needed a majority of the delegates to be represented. They gained and lost representation. New York, for example, did not appear until late July, by which time New York had stomped out and would never return. Rhode Island never participated. Of all the delegates, only 2 men showed up every day, Washington and Madison. With secrecy enforced, the only record of the proceedings came in Madison's private notes of the debate, an official tally of motions and votes, and a scattering of personal writings, notes, and letters, which this limitation limits what we know about Washington's role, because as presiding officer, under parliamentary rules, he did not speak on substantive matters inside the hall where Madison recorded the debate. But Washington did talk privately with other members, of course, and he voted with the Virginia delegation. He also supervised deliberations and called on members when to speak. For a modern parallel, think of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Boehner, does not speak in the substantive debate so long as he's the Speaker. And does anybody doubt that he's running the show? Or at least trying to run the show by brokering the deals and brokering the compromises and knowing who to call on and when to call on? That was Washington's role. The desire to create a central government with the power to tax, to maintain an army, and regulate interstate and international commerce. The record of his specific contributions, because he did not speak in the hall, remains somewhat oblique. We can only surmise them from the clues available, but there are a lot of such clues, and they are revealing, especially his own often decisive vote in the Virginia delegation. Because two of the members had to go home, George Wythe, because his wife was dying, he was left with a 5-member delegation that by the middle of the convention was split. 2 noes, consistently 2 yeses, and Washington's vote was usually decisive on how Virginia would vote. Indeed, in the end, it was Washington's vote for the convention, for the Constitution, that carried Virginia. Virginia would not have voted for the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention, but for Washington's decisive vote. But I'm getting a little bit ahead, and let me briefly go back and pick us up on what was happening in it, some of the clues we know about Washington. One day after the delegates committed themselves to secrecy, the Virginia delegation dropped its bombshell. Having participated in preparing it, Washington clearly conspired in the timing of its delivery. To begin, quote, the main business of the convention, as Madison termed it in his notes, Washington called on Randolph. The Virginia governor then presented his delegation's plan for a new constitution. As presented by Randolph, the plan contained the outlines for a national, that's the phrase used in it, a national government composed of a 2-house legislature, some sort of chief executive, and a judiciary with supreme and inferior courts. Citing the discord among the states, the rebellion in Massachusetts, the, quote, havoc of paper money, and its failure to pay its debts, Randolph, at the convention, argued that the old Confederation did not work. And, again quoting from him, raised the prospect of anarchy from the laxity of government everywhere. The hope, he said, in a national government with the power to legislate on matters of general concern and compel obedience. One skeptical delegate captured the speech's essence in a scribble that he sent off to his son. Sovereignty is the integral thing. We ought to be one nation. Now, Virginia had staked its ground, forcing others to respond. No delegate could doubt where Washington stood. He remained a voting member of the Virginia delegation, called on Randolph to speak first, and never suffered any interruption of what one critic called the governor's, quote, long and tedious speech. Clearly, Washington sided with Virginia and its plan. In doing so, he helped to hijack the convention. Congress had endorsed this gathering as a meeting to draft amendments to the Confederation. Washington's Virginia instead proposed using it to scrap the existing government and forge a nation. Capturing what he thought about, he didn't speak in the hall, but that very night he worked on a long letter that he mailed the next day to Thomas Jefferson. And here's what he wrote in that letter. The business of this convention is as yet too much in embryo to form any opinion of the result. That something is necessary, all here will agree. For the situation of the general government, if it can be even called a government, is shaken to its foundation and is liable to be overset at the next blast. In a word, and these are Washington's words, in a word, Confederation, is at an end. Unless a remedy is applied soon, anarchy and confusion will inevitably ensue. End quote. Washington's words on the day of Randolph's speech. After heatedly debating and narrowly defeating a motion to limit the proceedings to amending the Articles of Confederation, the convention accepted the Virginia plan as a starting point for its deliberations and never looked back. Washington sat silent in the hall, but Shirley spoke in private. Another letter written at this time Persuaded I am that the primary cause of all our disorders lie in the different state governments, and the tenacity of that power which pervades the whole of their systems. So long as states retained independent sovereignty, the country would falter. Washington's words. Now, the initial battle won, the war then raged over the precise structure and powers of Congress, the nature of the executive, protections for state-sanctioned slavery, and myriad other matters. Washington remained quiet in the hall, but wrote privately, quote, "The men who oppose a strong and energetic central government are, in my opinion, narrow-minded politicians or under the influence of local views." Of all the delegates, it was Alexander Hamilton and James Wilson, two pro-business nationalists with extremely close ties to Washington, who most vocally defended an open-ended grant of power to the central government. On June 18, for example, after New Jersey proposed a limiting list of powers in its alternate plan for a federal union, Washington exploded at the convention. "The general power must swallow up the state powers, otherwise it'll be swallowed up by them," he declared. Wilson was more discreet. Distancing himself from Hamilton's extreme remarks, he still argued that, quote, "the states should only survive as lesser jurisdictions or subdivisions of the nation." From start to finish, Washington presided over the convention without expressing his views on the proper extent of the central government's power. He didn't need to. Ever since his 1783 circular letter to the states, which was then the country's most best known and most widely read and spoken public document other than the Declaration of Independence, Washington stood as the personification of nationalism in the United States. His daily presence on the dais spoke louder than the speeches of anyone in the hall. It gave weight to the Virginia plan, which implicitly bore his imprimatur. And when Randolph drafted a broad enumeration of congressional powers that the Virginia delegation backed, it included every single one that Washington had publicly endorsed or privately endorsed in his letters or writings before the convention. Not everything Madison wanted, but everything that Washington had wanted. Now, evidence abounds for Washington's influence in shaping the various provisions of the Constitution, as opposed to the broad concept, and for securing the compromises that kept the convention on track. But rather than go into all those, and my book does go into many of those, let me just as an example, discuss his role in crafting the executive, that is the presidency, the executive branch, because it offers as good an example as any of the part he played in Philadelphia. Since everyone presumed that George Washington would become the first president, no one could conceive of the position without thinking of him in that role. Indeed, within the year, South Carolina's delegate Pierce Butler flatly stated that his colleagues at the convention, quote, "shaped their ideas and the powers to be given to the president by their opinions of Washington's virtue." Now, delegates, if you look back over the notes, delegates debated the executive at length on 3 separate occasions during the convention, each for over a week. In June, early June, during the first of these occasions, they raised virtually every issue about the presidency that would later occupy them. But they had trouble then even resolving whether one person or a committee of 3 should hold the office. Now, with Washington in the room, a unitary executive should have seemed obvious to all, especially since every state had but one governor. Fearful of investing too much power in a single person, however, some delegates, including two from Washington's own Virginia, favored an executive triumvirate like those of late Republican Rome. Denouncing the single executive, quote, as the fetus of monarchy, Randolph averred that the people would oppose it. Further, George Mason added that an executive troika could better represent the country's 3 regions, North, Middle, and South, than any one ruler. Now, these comments on a single executive, stated in the hall in front of everyone, and by rules they had to speak toward Washington when they spoke, so speaking directly to Washington, coming as they did from old friends, surely vexed Washington. That's clear from the letters he wrote privately, who prided himself on his Republican virtue, his public support, and his unbiased nationalism, that he could represent the whole country. Every delegate who knew him must have understood that Washington would never consent to serve as one member of an executive triumvirate, nor be suited for such a post. While he remained silent in the hall, others rallied to defend the sort of unitary executive that Washington was so clearly qualified to fill. Unity in the executive promotes vigor and dispatch in office, Wilson said, and by fixing responsibility served as the best safeguard against tyranny. Elderberg Gerry of Massachusetts added that a troika would be troublesome in war. It would be like a general with 3 heads, he declared. While these positions came out in the course of the formal debate, delegates clearly, and surely by their notes and letters it's clear, discussed them on other occasions as well. And this gives us a good opportunity to discuss how Washington played that other role. Now, the delegates themselves, all but Washington, were crowded into these overcrowded boarding houses and inns around Philadelphia, often 2 or 3 to a room. Washington, in contrast, lived in Robert Morris's elegant manor. Some described it as the most beautiful home in North America, where he could dine in comfort daily. But rather than dine in comfort at Morris's home, he often ate out with the delegates in their inns and halls, where they ate in groups at tables. And on June 2nd, after the extent of disagreement over the powers of the executive became first apparent, that first time when they were debating how to structure the executive, Washington chose to eat with the other delegates at City Tavern. The day's heated debate likely came up and surely remained on everybody's mind. While in session earlier that day, the members had raised and voted and could not resolve by their votes whether the United States should have 1 executive officer or 3. Now, later in that very day, as many of those delegates died with the man who would be that king, Washington's presence must have reassured them. As a frequent guest at City Tavern, Pierce Butler may have been present. If so, it might explain his later comment, quote, that the powers vested in the executive would not have been so great had not many of the members cast their eyes toward General Washington as president. At the convention's very next session, when they next met after that evening dinner, the states voted by a margin of 7-3 for a single executive and never looked back. Then, on every other recorded occasion, Washington voted for a stronger executive. And so it went for week after week as Washington successfully guided the convention to its historic conclusion in September, when all the remaining states voted for the Constitution, even though some individual delegates objected to part of it and did not support it. The convention then approved a cover letter. Remember, they'd been meeting in secret, so nobody knew the terms. The document was sent out with a cover letter signed only by George Washington for transmitting the finished draft to Congress. That cover letter, along with the document, was printed in newspapers throughout the country. And it read, again, signed only by Washington, "The friends of our country have long seen and desired that the power of making war, peace, and treaties, that of levying money and regulating commerce, and the corresponding executive and judiciary authority should be fully and effectively vested in the general government. These factors justified the consolidation of our union, in which is involved our prosperity, our safety, and perhaps our very national existence." This letter opened the public campaign for ratification. The accompanying resolutions asked Congress to forward the Constitution to the states for ratification, with 9 of them, not all 13, 9 of them required to launch the new union. Washington's signature on the cover letter and the resolutions made it look as if the Constitution came directly from him. He hadn't written the letter, it was Gouverneur Morris who wrote the letter, but they all decide only Washington would sign it. It would make it look like it was coming from him, and he was trusted. One day after the delegates signed the Constitution, Washington left for beloved Mount Vernon, ostensibly to let the people work their will. Indeed, on that very day, he vowed anything for or against. Yet only 2 days later, 2 days after saying that, to 3 former Virginia governors, along with identical letters urging them to support it. I sincerely believe that it's the best that could be obtained at this time. If nothing had been agreed to, anarchy would surely result. Now, with 2 of Virginia's delegates having refused to sign the document, and state leaders lining up behind them, Washington feared that the Constitution would face strong, heavy dominion. As much as he genuinely wanted to live quietly on his plantation and sincerely eschewed political power, Washington had so much time and so much of his reputation invested in the Constitution, and believed so strongly that his country could not survive without it, that its progress consumed him even as he resumed day-to-day management of his plantation. Like most Federalists, he was convinced that the choice lay between the Constitution and chaos. The preservation of liberty and property required ratification, and ratification required him. Early reports from every state sounded much the same. Federalists would rely on the public's trust in Washington to carry the day. Now, Washington knew the role that his name and reputation were playing in the campaign for ratification. He received and read newspapers from around the country and followed the unfolding drama in them and through a steady stream of letters from correspondents in every state. Those reports carried endless references to his central role at the convention. Yet most people cared less than he had signed the Constitution than he would lead the new government under it. For example, Connecticut's David Humphreys wrote to Washington, "What will tend more than anything to the adoption of the new system will be a universal opinion of your being elected president." No doubt Washington saw it coming, and without coveting the position, never denied that he would accept it. Even with him in their camp, however, Federalists faced the daunting task of ratifying the revolutionary shift of power from the states to the central government. Now, Federalists had the advantage of a document designed to address the grave economic and political problems then facing the country, and influential supporters returning from the convention to every state pushing for ratification. But led at first by dissenting delegates and soon joined by New York Governor George Clinton, Virginia orator Patrick Henry, and others, anti-Federalists were organizing to stop ratification. Whether he liked it or not, the clash would draw in Washington. As opposition to the Constitution emerged, Washington enlisted, pleaded with supporters to defend it, asking many of them to campaign for ratification. An October speech by Pennsylvania delegate James Wilson so pleased Washington that he sent copies of it to others and urged them to print it in their newspapers and distribute it in every state. He urged Hamilton, Madison, and Jay to write essays in the newspapers defending it. And looked what resulted, the Federalist Papers, which Washington received and then retransmitted out, asking newspapers to publish them. He increasingly, as he identified more completely with the Constitution, he increasingly railed against the opponents. He complained of the Anti-Federalists by October. To alarm the people seems to be the grounds of their plan. Every art that could inflame the passions and touch the interest of men have been used. The ignorant have been told that should the proposed government obtain, their land would be taken from them and their property disposed of them. Therefore, Washington said, seems to lie in misrepresentation. In contrast to them, he believed that individual liberty and private property could only survive with the Constitution. "I never saw him so keen for anything in my life," one visitor wrote about Washington near the end of 1787. By then, even though 5 states had ratified the document, formidable opposition remained in the key states of Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York. Knowing their importance, Washington stepped up his involvement. Now, of course, Washington had already been deeply involved in the ratification effort. Now, to win in Massachusetts, Madison advised Washington that more might be required of them. You might need to send a public letter supporting ratification, not just your private letters that are then handed around. Washington reluctantly did so. But even before that public letter could reach Massachusetts, another source publicly expressed his position. It confirmed his position. As noted, as I said, Washington often wrote private letters to key leaders urging ratification. Now, key parts of those surfaced in a Virginia newspaper in December 27 and were reprinted in 9 Massachusetts papers during the state's ratifying convention, which began on January 9, 1788. In that letter, which was published in these 9 Massachusetts papers during the convention, Washington wrote, "There is no alternative between the adoption of it and anarchy, and clear I am, if another federal convention is attempted, that the sentiments of its members will be more discordant or less accommodating than the last. In fine, they will agree on no plan." Federalists were hungry to hear these words from their icon. By March, some 50 newspapers around the country had reprinted this letter. The extract said, "I am fully persuaded that it is the best that can be obtained at this time, that it is free from many of the imperfections with which it is charged, and that it is it or this union that is before us to choose from." In one sentence, Washington had encapsulated the Federalist position. Now, the sides were so closely drawn in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Convention, that Washington's support may have proved decisive. That certainly was the opinion of the Massachusetts Gazette newspaper, which at the time suggested that in the future, quote, "the Federalists should be distinguished hereinafter by the name Washingtonians." Even after the vote, when that state narrowly ratified the Constitution in February, and others followed ratification, the Constitution remained one state shy of the 9 required for ratification as Virginia, New Hampshire, and New York opened their conventions in June. Washington wrote, just as Virginia's convention met, quote, "The plot thickens fast," and those were his words. To deal with the threat posed by Patrick Henry's oratory, Washington had all but ordered Madison to stand for election to the convention so that he could answer Henry point by point, a task the shy, withdrawn, even nerdy Madison dreaded. When Madison's election looked doubtful without campaign, Washington ordered him to stump for votes, something Madison had never done and really didn't want to do. But he did it under Washington's orders. Once the delegates convened, the debate went on for weeks, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. Between letters and newspaper reports, Washington received a blow-by-blow of Virginia's ratifying convention. Though at home, he might as well have been there. The truth was, but that at all state gatherings, always present, a force more powerful for being insubstantial. Washington's role in drafting the Constitution and the prospects of him becoming president made all the difference. To Washington, near the end of Virginia's convention, one anti-Federalist leader told that assembly, "Were it not for one great character in America, so many would not be for this government." In making arguments, Virginia anti-Federalists must have felt that they were shadowboxing with Washington, whose assumed role as president made what they saw as a fatally flawed system appeared attractive to many. On June 27, the Evening Stage brought news to Mount Vernon that Virginia had ratified the Constitution 2 days earlier. It passed by a mere 10-vote margin in a convention of over 300. Victors and vanquished alike recognized it as being as much a triumph for Washington as for the Constitution. "Be assured," Virginia anti-Federalist James Monroe said of Washington, "his influence carried this government." Well, these momentous events led Washington to reflect on all that Americans had achieved over the past years. And so in private letters, let me close with some of his private words of what he said. And because they're so meaningful then, and they're meaningful today when you think of countries around the world facing similar situations. He wrote in August, for example, "We have the unequaled privilege of choosing our own political institutions and improving upon the experience of mankind in the formation of a confederated government where due energy will not be inalienable rights of freemen. In a world ruled by hereditary monarchs, traditional dogmas, or military might, nothing like America's Republican experiment had ever occurred." So Washington wrote, "We exhibit at present the novel and astonishing spectacle of a whole people deliberating calmly on what form of government will be the best and most conducive to their happiness, and deciding with an unexpected degree of unanimity in favor of a system which they conceive as calculated to answer that purpose. Where before Washington had despaired of the country's survival as a free, unified republic, he now exuded confidence. So he wrote to Rochambeau, the great French general, when our people shall find themselves secure under an energetic government, when foreign nations shall be disposed to give us equal advantage in commerce from dread of retaliation, and when everyone under his own vine and fig tree shall begin to taste the fruits of freedom, then all of these blessings, for all of these blessings will surely come, will be referred to the fostering influence of the new Constitution. America's second revolution had secured the gains won in the first, with Washington again leading the charge. Over the course of 1788, Washington had articulated three main goals for the United States under the Constitution: respect abroad, prosperity at home, and development westward. Toward these ends, he envisioned a vigorous federal government, encouraging trade, manufacturing, and agriculture through effective tariffs, sound money, secure property rights, and a non-aligned foreign policy. He asserted, America under an effective government will be the most favorable country of any in the world for persons of industry and frugality, and not be less advantageous to the happiness of the lowest class of people because of the great plenty of unoccupied land. This was Washington's vision for the United States. And as a nation, required a second American Revolution, one conceived in the Confederation's failure, as that failure became apparent during the mid-1780s, debated at the Constitution, given birth through a tortuous ratification. Washington was out, just as he had been during the First Revolution, making, just as Henry Knox had predicted, father of our country. Thank you.
We have